It's human nature now for us to seek the quickest path to our goals. In our fast-paced world, we prioritize immediate results over long-term satisfaction, but it's time for us to slow down. For example, building this violin was different because everything was meticulously carved, measured, and fitted, forcing me to deliberately slow down. So today, I'm going to give this client exactly what she wants: clean, modern lines and a warm, inviting feel to the room. But I'm pushing myself to slow down and use a joinery technique that will remind you and I to enjoy the process. Let me start this off by saying your experiences will definitely be different than mine. Of course, you don't need to build a violin to learn how to enjoy the process. And honestly, I had no clue that project was going to give me that value. But here we are years later, and at this point I'm just trying to have a little bit of fun. So I'm cutting these 6/4 hickory boards all sorts of different ways just to see if I like one method over the other. And so far the jigsaw was pretty dang slow, but this miter saw works pretty dang good. A track saw also fares pretty well, but this hickory is some hard stuff. I mean, you could even use an antique skill saw from your grandpa that has a grinder blade on it. Silly grandparents. I'm honestly sure that grinder blade was used for something remarkable, and he's probably laughing at me from the heavens. But we're not done trying different methods. I still want to try a hand saw. Oh man, I suck at cutting by hand. Somehow I managed to cut a curve. That's pretty remarkable. So back to the miter saw I go, and really, can you blame me? That was ridiculous. I may be a woodworker, but I at least know my limits. When it comes to cutting a board in half, we sure have a lot of different ways to approach that these days. Some ways are more accurate than others, and other ways are more enjoyable than the rest. But cutting a board in half is really only step number one. And now I have to hope my tools can actually flatten these cinder blocks. Did I mention that hickory is extremely hard? Yeah, that skipping doesn't tend to happen on other woods. My joiner is just having a hissy fit. And while I'm mentioning it, if you happen to use hickory for a project, you'll probably see that it's fairly cheap. But I want you to recognize that just because it's cheap doesn't mean the job should be cheap. This wood beats your tools to death. And it's so flippin' heavy, you will definitely be exhausted at the end of the day. Alright, it's actually 2 days later, and this wood has had some good time to sit, and it didn't really warp much because it is thick stock, so that's to be expected. And I'm not looking forward to jointing this stuff, because joining the faces on these big hickory boards is going to take some muscle. But let's do it. Yeah, it's definitely going to need a good waxing before this round, which is helping a lot more than I was expecting it to. It honestly feels like I'm cutting poplar now. How does that happen? I don't know. Either way, if I forget to wax my table in the future and I'm crying about it, just feel free to tell me in the comments. I would normally pass a board like this up, especially with a splinter this big, but the grain on this board is too hard to pass up, so it's worth a try to see if I can fix the splinter now. That way when it's milled, it might just disappear. At this point, the fix has been sitting for about 2 hours, so I think it's time that I can throw it through the joiner. I'm just making sure that I don't run it against the grain so that it doesn't re-tear that out. Some CA glue and activator also helps to finalize some areas that weren't exactly perfect. And I would say that's invisible enough. Now I can plane the width of the shelves and everything is ready for the next step. So I am setting the fence, but I'm not going to be ripping. So you may notice that I'm cross-cutting, and I am going to use the rip fence. And that's mainly because these boards are wide enough, and I'm using a miter gauge to support the workpiece. So I didn't worry about tear out on these because obviously these ends will be tenons. So I'll have to worry about the tear out on the actual shoulders of the tenons when I cut those. But for now, I need to cut the long slats before we do any tenoning. So he said obviously there will be tenons on the end of the boards, which I haven't even mentioned this yet. I'm going to use real deal mortise and tenons for every single joint in this entire project. And I'm laying them out so that they air dry evenly, that way they don't warp before I get to that point. So as I mentioned earlier, there will be tenons, which means there will also be mortises. With that said, I need my router to plunge and create mortises across the grain. And I don't have a bushing that will fit a 3/4 router bit. So instead, I'll just make a jig that will secure this router really well so that my mortises are perfect. I made the stops at the ends a 1/4 inch thick so that the screw on the router doesn't interfere. How this jig works is I first place my first stop, then I route that mortise. Then I can place that same stop on the back side and route the second mortise. I think this is pretty cool because this makes 2 separate mortises that are exactly in line with each other. And right here, I'm just cutting through the jig. On the actual shelves, I won't cut all the way through. And marking the direction of travel is also important. Lastly, I want to mark a center line on the jig so that I can align this with any center line mark that I have on the workpiece. I realized that in order to make this jig even more accurate, I would need to add a couple stops on the bottom that would essentially grip onto the shelf. That way it doesn't move side to side, and now I don't have to worry about this part of the alignment. The top and the bottom are the longest 2 pieces, so I should probably start with these since these will actually set the stage for everything else. So with both of them side by side, I can begin marking out where each mortise will go. And I'm using an X-Acto knife because 1, my marking knife is broken, and 2, a knife line will be a lot easier to align with the jig. I'm also penciling in a center line on the area that will accept the small mortises later. So the first shelf attaches to the bottom by these 2 risers, and to make sure those are in the exact locations that I want, I have to remember that there's a back that's connecting to the bottom, so there will be an offset for this section. So this exact offset is actually incorrect, and I'll talk about that here in a second. When you start doing mortises in your projects, measurements start getting a little tricky because we always have to remember exactly how much offset each mortise creates, and if there's mortises on either side, all sorts of different things. So I actually just realized that this offset is wrong because I need room for a tenon here. So this board actually sticks in another 3/4 of an inch. So this offset is actually correct because it allows one of the boards extra wood for a tenon to be cut. And this is a huge reason why loose tenons are a lot easier, no matter what loose tenon you choose, because then you can cut your workpiece to the actual length it needs to be, and then you're only cutting mortises. Any tenons are added later. I used to do all sorts of this stuff without even a plunge base on my router. I just had some junky fixed base router. And I would actually have to tilt the router into place in order to plunge, which was a little dangerous now that I think about it. Boy, do I not miss those days, but it was certainly possible. Now that I have some mortises cut, I can explain why this is so important. If this was one long mortise, then the tenon would have to be 5.5 inches long, and that's longer than we typically want for a hardwood tenon because wood movement would actually destroy the bond between the glue and the wood itself. So what we do is we separate it into 2 smaller tenons where it's much harder for wood movement to destroy that bond. So this might be confusing to some people, and wood movement is kind of a silly phenomenon. But to make things simple, if you split it up into 2 tenons, then both of those tenons are held captive. They literally can't go anywhere, and oftentimes, even without glue, they get stuck. So with glue, it ain't going anywhere. So here's another reason we want 2 mortises. If this was one long mortise, then this would be very breakable right here. So splitting it into 2 adds this, which makes it much stronger. I will also have to cut mortises into this back panel to support the shelves, but I have no clue where the locations will be until I cut the tenons into these risers and get everything fit together. I'm using a dado stack because I flippin' hate the router table. Cutting a test piece first will make sure that my fit is actually correct because it could be super loose at this point. And it is actually a smidge too loose, so I changed that before cutting the actual workpieces. And this method only works if every single piece is the exact same thickness. If they aren't, then some tenons would be extremely loose and others would be tight, and I would certainly be fired. The thin slats also get the same treatment. I ended up deciding to leave a little bit of room so that I could clean everything up at the router table. Plus, this is a convenient time that I can separate the one long tenon into 2 shorter tenons. And this is just one of many processes that it'll take to get these joints going. And of course, there are tools out there that would make this faster, but you'd be surprised at how enjoyable this process is. Alrighty then. So now that I have the tenons cut and the mortises cut, the only problem left is that the tenons are square on the corners and the mortises are round. So I have a decision to make. I can either square off the mortises, which is hard because this is hickory, and squaring off mortises in hickory is not an easy task. Or I can just round over these tenons by hand, and I'm thinking I might just do that. I'm glad I cut a few of them by hand. What I can tell you I experienced is that it brought me into the present moment and I could really just feel the wood. And I know that sounds like a complete hippie, but it really is nice to just get intimate with some wood once in a while. But now I want to try this jig. The wings on it keep the router upright and also keep it from cutting the face sides of the tenons. So this is more of a hybrid method because I'm making sure that the router bit is just a touch too high, then I can clean everything up with a chisel. Here's a nice before and after. Alright, so I got my pill-shaped tenons for my pill-shaped mortises. Let's see if it fits. And I would say it's super close, it's just a touch too tight. So I'm probably gonna have to finesse all of these with a sanding block just a touch. Then I can dry fit everything together and get the exact positions of where the back mortises go. You might be tempted to get a perfect fit right off the saw or the router table. Trust me, if you leave them just a touch tight, then it's so much easier to finesse them afterwards rather than deal with a few of them being super loose. That's just how joinery goes, and you'll find out for yourself. As I'm dry fitting, I'm tailoring each section perfectly so that it fits that mortise exactly perfect. And did I happen to mention that I'm trying to get them perfect? Well, perfection really is a figment of my imagination. And it really is up to the eye of the beholder, and in this case, the beholder is quite a stickler. The second shelf only has one riser, so I cut these extra boards just to keep everything parallel and easy going. Then I can continue that fun process until I'm not tall enough. And all my measurements have come down to this very moment, and it is...
Ooh, that is exactly where it needs to be, which is perfect. So now we can work on the back.
As I mentioned earlier, I needed all of the risers in place in order to do this. Mark each tenon so that I know exactly where it's going to go. And just so I don't screw it all up now, I might as well mark the spots so that I know exactly where to cut. And the jig shows the exact spots so it's easy to line up.
It all fits, and I'm very thankful. Now I can move on to those small mortises. The reason why I waited this long is because I knew I would have to modify that jig, and I still needed the jig for this back plate. So now that I'm done with it, it's time to modify it.
Now the jig references perpendicular to the way it did before. And a new mark aligns the center line of the mortise. And that's because the router is going to travel much less distance than it did before, about 1/4 inch this time. And that makes this process much quicker than the last mortises, because on the last ones, I had to do 3 successive cuts, but on this one, I could just do a full depth cut in one go. Now, I was waiting for this part because I was a little nervous on how I should go about doing it. And this little tiny jig might be hard to balance the router on, but it's worth a try. It would actually be a perfect opportunity to cut these by hand since it is tricky with a router, but it actually does work. And like I've said before, it works if you work it.
Before I go cutting the rest of the tenons, I should probably make sure that it actually fits first. Perfect. What is going on? Luckily, that last one did not screw up the piece. So here we go again.
And the rest went smoothly, so there's really nothing fun to show you. But I haven't had a chance yet to put the whole thing together, so for the sake of a good thumbnail, I should probably keep moving before I discredit myself. And at this point, if you're still here, I really hope that you're getting a lot of value out of the video. And if not good value, at least a few good laughs. And if not a few good laughs, at least a few mean comments, because I love those things. But what I would love even more is if you took the time to subscribe, because if you truly enjoy this content, then you will love my future upcoming videos.
Here's a pretty cool tip. If you use a smaller hose like 3/16 and make it short like 15 feet, you'll use a lot less material to prime the pump, like 8 ounces versus 20 ounces.
I'm pre-finishing these for 2 good reasons. The first reason is it would be really hard to finish all these pieces if it was all assembled. The second reason is there are 33 joints in total, and to keep the glue squeeze out clean on every single one of those would be a slim chance, so pre-finishing will make cleanup a breeze. And at this point it would be a waste to spray the edges, so I'm only spraying the faces. The edges will have to get sanded flush after everything's assembled. The tape worked like a charm to keep the finish away from any joints. And hanging them helped me be able to spray both sides at the same time. Since this was a water-based finish, it could warp one side if you only spray one at a time. But now it's go time. There's no looking back at this point. It all comes down to this. We did plenty of due diligence by dry fitting everything beforehand, and I made sure to mark every single joint with a letter so that I would know how it goes back together. So surely nothing could go wrong at this point, right? Well, before we find out, I want to thank my patrons. For real though, thank you so much. My Patreon is growing and that's giving me the ability to create exclusive content. So if you want access to extra videos like the last 22-minute one I made, virtual hangout sessions, or even update videos on what Fortress is up to behind the scenes, then you can just click the link in the description. Thanks. As I mentioned earlier, cleaning up the glue squeeze out is really easy because everything's pre-finished. And so far, honestly, nothing's really going wrong. In fact, it's going so right, I feel like it's too good to be true. Could it actually be possible that nothing's gonna go wrong at all?
All right, luckily that first portion went perfect. Everything's square, the joints are nice and tight. I didn't have any problems, probably because we did that dry fit. And so I'm gonna wait for this glue to set up, then I can finish the top and bottom. Because in order to move this thing, I need to be able to take the clamps off because it's already like, I would probably say 120 pounds. So I have one slight problem. I feel like this is wedged in pretty tight. And if I try to pull it out now, it's just gonna like scratch up the finish and I do not want that to happen. So let's see if this works. I'm gonna be really light because the glue has not set for 24 hours. I just need enough to get this out. Perfect.
So the truth is out. Nothing horrific has happened yet, which makes me happy because the mission for this project was to enjoy the process, and it would be really hard to enjoy it if I had to kick myself in the face every step of the way. And for some reason, I'm making sure everything is straight and square, even though at this point it would be too hard to fix. I would say this whole thing is about 150 pounds, maybe 200 with the clamps on it. So I'm pretty lucky that I'm even able to get it on the table because I need to finish these edges. Overall, they came out pretty flush, so just a little bit of finessing here and there, and that's it. I think by now I've realized something important about where I am in my woodworking. If I treat it like my sobriety, I have to consciously have the awareness to be present and enjoy the moment that I'm in. After all, this industry has taught me to get things done, be as productive as I can, and do not screw up. But the truth is, by slowing down and keeping my head in the game, I didn't really screw up at all. This project. If you liked this project, then you'll definitely like this next video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.